Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Zahra Aghajan, with whom I had the pleasure of working together, at least for a little while, when we were both postdocs in Nanthia Suthana's lab here at UCLA. Dr. Aghajan did her bachelor's in Israel at the Sharif University of Technology.
Iran.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. In Iran at the Sharif University of Technology in Tehran. And then she came to UCLA to do her master's and her PhD in physics. And here at UCLA, she worked in the labs of Mayank Mehta, Nanthia Suthana, and Itzhak Fried. And published a very impressive and exciting list of publications in the field of neuroscience and more specifically on the neural representations of space and memory in both humans and rodents. And last year she joined the company Kernel, where she now focuses on the link between brain and behavior and wearable neurotechnologies and artificial intelligence and machine learning. So I'm very much looking forward to your talk, and thank you so much for being here, Zahra.
Thanks, Matthias. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here, and it's great to be back here at UCLA. And also, thank you for being here, and thanks to those of you who are tuning in via Zoom. So as you learned by now, I'm a data scientist at Kernel. And today I'm going to talk to you about the Kernel Flow, which is a high-throughput, scalable, wearable neurotechnology. So we're going to talk about different aspects of this technology in this talk. First things first, Kernel, we're a full-stack neurotech company. We're actually located here in LA, in Culver City specifically. Kernel was founded in 2016, and since 2018, we've been focusing on developing non-invasive optical brain imaging technology. And we do everything in-house, all the way from hardware chip design to IRB-approved neuro research. And we're constantly looking for new members to join us. So please feel free to check out our website for new job opportunities. We'd love to have some talented people like you work with us. Okay, so what is Kernel Flow? It is an optical brain imaging system that uses time domain functional near-infrared spectroscopy, or TDF-NIRS to be more succinct. And it also has 6 channels of EEG. So we know that TDF-NIRS is a gold standard for optical brain imaging. However, the equipment that is currently used out in the market, it looks like this. It's bulky, and usually you get very limited number of channels. And in fact, when I was preparing material for this talk, I read a sentence on Wikipedia that I would like to read to you because it really captures the pain, or rather frustration, that the person felt when writing that sentence. So here it is. TD-based devices are totally immobile, space-consuming, the most difficult to make, costliest, hugest, and heaviest. Okay? And even so, they have the highest depth sensitivity and are capable of presenting most accurate values of baseline hemoglobin concentration, oxygenation. Okay, so we know it's valuable, but this is what we're working with. Now, I would like to juxtapose how the Kernel Flow device looks like. It's shrunk to a helmet. So not to be too dramatic here, but it's kind of a big leap to get all of the positives of a TDF-NIRS system while shedding all of the negatives, like being heavy, what was it, like the costliest, so on and so forth. Okay, so just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I thought I would briefly explain the principles, the general principles of FNIRS, so that we make sure that we understand what kind of brain signal we're recording, and then more specifically focus on the time domain FNIRS. So how does this work? So suppose the light is propagating in the head, and so it either scatters or gets absorbed. And it so turns out that the hemoglobin is a significant absorber of near-infrared light. It just so happens that way. So what this means is that the changes in the absorbed light would then translate into the changes in blood oxygen levels. Okay, so in FNIRS, we're recording the hemodynamic signal, the amount of blood oxygen levels. So how does this work? In the continuous wave FNIRS, which is the most commonly used devices, you're constantly shining light on the head with a certain intensity, and the light would get absorbed by the tissue, and you're constantly measuring the light. So you can imagine that because it gets absorbed, the intensity would fall, okay? It also turns out that the amount of absorption of light by oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin, they're different at different wavelengths. So here we're looking at the profile. In red, you have the oxygenated hemoglobin. In blue, you have deoxygenated hemoglobin. And you see the extinction coefficient at different wavelengths, okay? So how do we go from the changes in optical density and light intensity to hemoglobin concentration? For that, we use the modified Beer-Lambert law. And eventually, we're interested in these two delta X's, which is the change in concentration of oxy and deoxy. By the way, I'm going to use oxy for oxygenated, deoxy for deoxygenated, because it's too much tongue twister. So we're ultimately interested in this. Now think about it. If your system is shining light at two different wavelengths, you have the change in optical density in wavelength 1, lambda 1. You have the change in optical density in lambda 2. So you have the left-hand side of this equation. And also you have the absorption or extinction coefficients of the two different lights and oxy and deoxy. So you have this matrix right here. And voila, you have two unknowns, you have two equations, and it's solvable, which is pretty neat, right? You shine two different lights, you get oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin concentration levels. How is time domain NIRS different? Here, instead of continuously shining light on the brain, you send a single laser pulse at a given time. What happens to this pulse? It also travels through the tissue. It can get scattered or absorbed, but you can have photons that only travel through superficial layers, such as path number 1 here. At the same time, you can have photons that would travel to deeper tissue, like path 5 here. And because the speed of light is constant in a tissue, you can imagine that the photons that travel the longer distance would arrive at a later time. So what you will get is this histogram, or the distribution of the time of flight of photons, where you know that photons that arrive at different times more likely travel different depths, okay? So you can get a lot of interesting information from this histogram. So this is why when that user wrote on Wikipedia that it has high depth sensitivity, this is why, because we can kind of guess how far the photons traveled, okay? All right, so now that we're on the same page about how FNIRS work, I want to reintroduce Kernel Flow. Oh, did I skip a slide? Nope. Okay, so you might ask, what are some of the use cases of FNIRS systems? It has been used in a wide range of applications, such as attention and focus, cognitive load, social experiences, aging, which is something I'm personally very interested in because it correlates with memory, so on and so forth, mental health, care quantification, and stroke and TBI, among many others that are not listed here. So it has a very wide range of applications. And because it's non-invasive, it could be very, very useful for studying the brain. Okay, so now that we're on the same page, I would like to reintroduce Kernel Flow. So Kernel Flow is a TD-FNIR system, which covers the full head. You can see there are frontal, temporal, sensory. But because we have some spatial and temporal multiplexing, the effective sampling rate is at 10 Hertz. It also has a modular design, which means that you can start with a minimum of 12 modules and expand based on your needs. So what are modules? Modules are these guys right here. They have sources on them. Each module has a laser source and is surrounded by 6 detectors. So remember, TD-NIRs, you send a pulse, you receive the pulse. And a full head system, it consists of 52 of these modules. So let's do the math. We have 52 sources. We have 52 times 6 detectors, 500 plus channels, up to 1,000 channels of recordings. Why? Because the light from a single source can not only be seen by the detectors in a given module, but also by other detectors. So we're talking about really high throughput, large scale amount of data. And it's a dual wavelength system. So we have lasers at 690 nanometers and 850 nanometers, which we learned is kind of necessary for this kind of analysis, right? Okay, so we're at the phase where we are currently shipping pre-production units to our Flow 50 partners, which are people from research organizations, medical institutes, and companies who are using the Kernel Flow however their hearts desire. You can see there are some really big names among our partners. And also, last week, we actually launched the Flow U program for academics, where you get to use the system free for 12 months. And just to, maybe it's worth emphasizing something, that Kernel Flow is not just a device, but we're putting a lot of efforts and time on the analysis and modeling teams, such that at the end of your data recording, you can get pre-processed data on the cloud ready within minutes, which you as academics know, like data processing, it takes a long time. So it's really nice to automatize those and then provide a cloud-based environment for further analysis. So how does the Kernel Flow data actually look like? First things first, we are able to detect physiological signals such as breathing. So what we're looking at here is data from a breath hold task, during which participants alternated between periods of rhythmic breathing in purple and breath hold in green. In red, we are looking at the oxy signal. In blue, we're looking at the deoxy signal. And if you notice, you can totally see the oscillation, the breathing oscillations during rhythmic breathing. And on top of this, the sampling rate of the system is large enough that we can detect cardiac signal. So here we are looking at data, total photon counts on different channels. So if we focus on data from one of the channels for the 850 nanometer laser, you can see the heart rate oscillation on roughly 1 Hertz. So this is one of those scenarios that you might think that physiological data could be a confound, but no, it's one of those cases where their noise is my signal. Imagine instead of having to pay for extra equipment and software to detect physiology, some of those hardwares are actually expensive, you can actually get all of this physiological data in the same system. We also had to do a lot of experiments to validate our system to make sure that we can detect the signals that other people in the field see. And one of the more famous or more commonly used experiments for this purpose is the finger tapping experiment. How does this look like? So you have periods of rest interleaved with periods of tapping your fingers against your thumb. And you also have blocks where you do your right hand and left hand, and the order is randomized. So what do we expect to see in this task? Any ideas? So we would, exactly, so we expect motor signals, but how? We expect that when we are tapping our left hand, we see higher activation in the right motor area. And conversely, when we're tapping our right hand, we see more activation on the left motor area, right? And this is exactly what we see. So we're looking at data from a right motor channel. In red, you have your oxy signal. And you see every time you see a green block, which is a left tapping block, you have an increase in the oxy signal and pretty much nothing or a decrease during right tapping. And you can do simple analysis such as epoching the data to see, like, put all of the right tapping blocks together and so on. So on the left, we're looking at a channel from the left motor. So you see this solid line is data from right tapping blocks. You see this beautiful hemodynamic response increase in the oxy. And conversely, if you look at a channel from the right motor area, you see a higher activation during left tapping blocks. And if you look at what's happening across the brain, you see this topo plot, which shows nice lateralized activation for left minus right contrast. And this is data from one participant, by the way. So you can see this in individual participants. Now, what happens if we do a group analysis? So what we're looking at here is data from 10 subjects, 19 sessions. This is GLM analysis, which is commonly done in fMRI literature, in which you model the brain activation as a function of behavioral and other variables. And again, you see the expected lateralized activation mostly appearing on the motor area. And I want to bring your attention to something here that I'm calling this sensor space. Why? Because you see the stars are actually the location of our sources. The circles are the location of our detectors. And each line is a channel that is formed between them. So what other space can we work in? We can work in voxel space. How is that possible? So I mentioned to you, there is a lot of information in the histogram or the distribution of time of flights, including depth information. So you can actually use the shape of those histograms to reconstruct the brain signal in voxel space, which will look like this. So this is the exact same GLM analysis now in voxel space. As expected, the lateralized activation in the motor area. And this is nice because once the data gets to this point, you can, which is usually a nifty format, you can just use whatever fMRI software that you are used to and then take the data from there. And just to give you another snippet of how the voxel space reconstructed brain data looks like, I'm going to play you a video clip from the time that our CEO, Brian Johnson, was interviewed by Lex Friedman for his podcast. So what happened here was they both wore a Kernel Flow device, and Brian was telling Lex jokes, and we reconstructed their brain activity during this conversation. Okay, let's make sure this works. Ooh. Okay.
What kind of fish performs brain surgery?
I don't know.
A neurosurgeon.
I actually didn't know sturgeon is a type of fish, so I had to go Google it to find this joke funny. But after knowing that, it's pretty funny. But that's not the point of this. It's the video, but just to show that we can reconstruct brain activation and deactivation, which I apologize, I forgot to mention. The hotter colors correspond to activation and the blue colors correspond to deactivation. So we can actually reconstruct the signal in time. Okay, so what's the point of all of this, you might ask? Kernel is eventually interested in developing neuroscience for the people. If you can think about it, you can think about it as a fitness tracker or a Fitbit for the mind, Okay, so what does it actually take for an individual to record and understand their own brains? What does it take? Well, there are quite a few necessary technical developments. First of all, the hardware has to be low cost and scalable. So we should be able to produce thousands or millions of headgear that people can use. And in fact, we have generated thousands of flow modules in-house already. It has to be comfortable and adjustable gear. If it's not comfortable, nobody's going to use it, right? Either, no matter how much in love with science you are, you're going to use it for a week and then just dump it. So it has to be comfortable. It has to have a consumer-friendly setup guidance. So it needs to be more like setting up a fitness tracker as opposed to having a dedicated neuroscientist by your side. Although that could be like a good job market for neuroscientists. You can have like NeuroPal, a neuroscientist for everyone. You also need to have fast and automated data processing. Again, the data processing needs to be done without the intervention of a programmer or a neuroscientist. So it needs to go away from MATLAB and Python into software and UI that is understandable by the general public. It needs to have interpretable results. What does this mean? It needs to move away from saying, oh, there was more activation in the prefrontal cortex, to what it actually means for the user, right? And last but not least, it needs to take ethical consideration and privacy into account. And eventually, any technology that is developed in this realm always has to be for the benefit of the individual. And at Kernel, we take ethical considerations very seriously as developing the hardware. So we're actively thinking about these and working on these issues. Now, we think that we at Kernel, we can't predict all the ways that people want to use their brain data, right? But we think that we have some ideas of what people might actually be curious about. And usually they fall in two broad categories. So we have the daily brain and the stable brain. What does this mean? So just to clarify, I'm talking about some functional measurement of the brain activity patterns, okay? And as you can guess, some measurements can fluctuate greatly from day one to day two on a day-to-day basis, right? But then, as you know, some fitness trackers, they would give you a measure of readiness, a score for readiness for the day. So it would be really nice to come up with a metric like that using a neurotechnology. And we would also like to probe the stable brain. So again, we're talking about changes that happen slowly across months or our lifetime. And we're talking about some functional measurement you can think about it as activation on a given task, or even patterns of functional connectivity during rest periods. How is this useful? So we know that there might be some slow changes that happen due to aging, due to medical conditions, and also brain training such as meditation. So it would be nice to be able to track these slow changes across time. How are we? So where are we at Kernel in terms of our progress on neuroscience for individuals? So obviously, we are making constant system improvements towards rich and robust signals that are easily captured and analyzed. This is pretty much what I'm working on. That's part of my job, working on it on a day-to-day basis. And also, we're actively exploring these three topics that I will get into detail in the next few slides. So we're looking at video gaming and performance, and you can think about that as the daily brain, so the fast time scale changes that happen in your brain. We are looking at variability in sleep on inhibitory control. So this you could think of as a more medium time scale. And finally, we're collecting data for a meditation study 3-month meditation study. So this one you can actually think of as a more long-term time scale. Okay, so let's get into the details of this. So for video gaming and performance, we had 7 participants play a first-person shooter video game. And the task was presented in a block design manner with 16 blocks. And in half of the blocks, the task required motor responses as well as planning, okay? And in the other half, it only required motor planning. So what did we see? We noticed that on the blocks that required planning, there was an elevated activation in the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of expected from the literature, but I think this was the first demonstration that with planning, you need more activity in your prefrontal areas. In the second study, which looks at variability in sleep on inhibitory control, what happened was we tracked participants' sleep using a fitness tracker. And then as a proxy for the inhibitory control, we had them do a go, no-go task, okay? And what we're looking at here is the correlation between the duration of sleep at night and the beta weights. Let me recap. So we have the go, no-go task, and then we can do a GLM analysis to model the brain activity as a function of go and no-go to get a sense of what is the contrast between those conditions. And what we're looking at here is the correlation between the beta weights of that contrast with sleep duration. That was a lot of things to unpack. So what that means is that there was a correlation between the duration of sleep and the difference in brain activation during the inhibitory control task. Did that make sense? Okay, good. I forgot to mention, this is data from 1 participant across 10 sessions. This is the power of longitudinal studies. Now, finally, we have, this is still ongoing. We have a 3-month meditation study. For this, we had 25 participants who learned to meditate using the commercial app for 12 weeks. And here you're looking at the number of recorded sessions per subject. So we're collecting a large amount of data. And the brain activity here was recorded during meditation and also other attentional tasks that they were doing before or after meditation. Some of these attention tasks are, for example, the Stroop task or a mind-wandering task, etc. And what I'm showing you here is preliminary results from the Stroop task. So what did this task entail? So you had words with color, and you had congruent blocks where the color actually matched the word. And you had mixed blocks where some of the words actually didn't match the color. Okay? And we were using 3 colors of red, yellow, and blue. So what we're seeing here is that reaction time during mixed blocks, shown on Y, is larger compared to congruent only blocks shown on the x-axis, which makes sense. Like, you have to so I actually did this task and then it's quite difficult. So I do get why the reaction time is longer. And what do we see in terms of brain data? We see exactly the pattern that we expect. In the mixed blocks, we see higher activation in the prefrontal cortex compared to congruent blocks, because presumably you have to do decision making, right? Now, what's happening in terms of the brain data during meditation? That analysis is actually cooking up as we speak. And maybe the next time I get to talk to you, I'll have more results on that. But it's a very exciting data set that we're working on at the moment. And not only that, but we're also expanding. So we're opening up this attention study to the public. So we're recruiting. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to research@kernel.com. And we're really excited about the possibility of having data from hundreds of people to to be able to make some conclusive understandings from the brain data. And what are some of the questions that remain? So this is the million-dollar question. How do we turn these complex brain signals to a metric that is available and understandable to everyone? Right? This is, as I said, we're all in search of the answer to this question. And another thing is that how do we make sure that the variability that we see from day to day is a result of something interesting? For example, if that variability is a result of your stress levels, that is great information to have, right? But what if the participant just wore the helmet differently that day? This is boring. This is something boring that we don't want to have to deal with. So just to summarize, we're trying to turn all of these complex signals of the brain into something that is easily understandable by the public. And to do this, we are running this large-scale longitudinal studies where we have multiple measurements, repeated measurements from an individual. And we usually aim for like 12 to 15 sessions per participant. So to conclude, Kernel Flow is developed to record and understand the brain by the individual. In other words, the aim is to empower the individual to understand what works for their brain the best. And in the process, we're working on developing something that is easy to use, easy to adopt, and something that is scalable. Again, as I mentioned, we're hoping we could scale to thousands or millions of participants, or at that point, it would be people just using it as a Fitbit. This technology needs to have high throughput, high quality data, and it needs to provide measurements at different scales. This could be either time scales, as we discussed, it could be the daily brain, it could be the slow changing brain, and also in terms of personalized or group level analysis. So we need to have access to all of that data. And this work is made possible because of the hard work of many, many people across the hardware, software, analysis, modeling, and neuroscience team. And I'm a part of the analysis team that I'm really grateful to be. I actually think my colleagues might be on the call to support me now. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time and attention. And I would love to get questions from you. I thought I would leave enough time so that we can have discussions, and I'd be more than happy to answer. Thank you.